The biggest mistake you can make inside a prison is believing the quietest man is the weakest. The lunch crowd inside Redstone State Prison exploded with laughter as dozens of inmates gathered around the long cafeteria tables, eager for another afternoon of cheap entertainment. Metal trays clattered across the room while correctional officers watched from elevated positions, accustomed to loud voices but always alert for anything unusual. At the center of the growing crowd stood Isaiah Brooks, a 36-year-old black inmate who had arrived less than 2 days earlier. Wearing a clean orange prison jumpsuit and carrying nothing more than a lunch tray, he quietly searched for an empty seat without making eye contact with anyone. That simple decision attracted exactly the kind of attention every new inmate hoped to avoid. Derek Collins, the white inmate who controlled the cafeteria through reputation and intimidation rather than constant confrontation, leaned back against a nearby table with several followers surrounding him. One of them pointed toward Isaiah and laughed. "The new guy looks like he is afraid to sit down." Another inmate deliberately stepped into Isaiah's path, forcing him to stop. Isaiah calmly smiled and took one step sideways, intending to continue toward an empty table. The movement only encouraged more laughter. Derek slowly walked forward, folded his arms, and looked Isaiah up and down as though evaluating him. "Around here," he said with a confident grin, "new people do not choose where they eat." The surrounding inmates watched closely, expecting the newcomer to argue or become angry. Isaiah simply answered in a calm voice, "I am only looking for a quiet place to finish lunch." His respectful tone amused the crowd even more. Derek glanced at his followers before shrugging with exaggerated disappointment. "You picked the wrong cafeteria for peace and quiet." Before Isaiah could take another step, several inmates crowded around him and, in one sudden motion, lifted him onto the middle of a sturdy cafeteria table. Trays slid aside, conversation stopped, and nearly every head inside the room turned toward the unexpected spectacle. Isaiah landed sitting upright instead of falling awkwardly. He calmly adjusted the sleeve of his orange prison jumpsuit, brushed a few crumbs from his shoulder, and slowly looked around the silent cafeteria. His expression showed neither fear nor anger. It was almost as though he had expected something like this to happen. Derek smiled proudly, convinced the entire room had just witnessed another reminder of who controlled Redstone State Prison. "Now everyone can see the new guy," he announced loudly. More laughter echoed across the cafeteria. Isaiah quietly stood on the table, maintaining perfect balance without rushing. He looked directly at Derek for the first time since entering the room. Then he spoke so softly that the nearest inmates leaned closer to hear every word. "You still have time to walk away." For a brief second, the laughter continued. Then something changed. Isaiah's calm eyes never moved from Derek's face, and an uneasy silence slowly replaced the amusement. Even the correctional officers noticed the sudden shift in atmosphere, though none of them yet understood why the quiet newcomer seemed completely unconcerned about standing alone before an entire cafeteria filled with men who believed they held every advantage. 48 hours earlier, a gray prison transport bus rolled through the reinforced gates of Redstone State Prison beneath an overcast afternoon sky. The heavy steel doors closed behind the vehicle with a deep metallic sound that echoed across the intake yard. Isaiah Brooks stepped onto the concrete carrying a small cardboard property box containing a family photograph, 2 hardcover books, a worn notebook, and a neatly folded Bible. Unlike the other newly transferred inmates, he did not stare at the guard towers or the endless rows of razor wire surrounding the prison. Instead, he quietly thanked the correctional officer directing the intake line before taking his place without complaint. Officer Melissa Grant immediately noticed the difference. Most new inmates entered Redstone displaying anxiety, frustration, or resentment. Isaiah displayed none of those emotions. His posture remained relaxed, his voice respectful, and his eyes constantly observed the environment rather than the people around him. During fingerprinting, medical screening, and orientation, he answered every question politely without offering unnecessary conversation. When another inmate loudly complained about the lengthy intake process, Isaiah simply waited patiently until his turn arrived. One officer jokingly asked whether he had spent years inside prisons because he appeared unusually comfortable. Isaiah smiled gently before replying, "I have learned that staying calm helps people notice what really matters." The answer surprised everyone within earshot. After receiving his orange prison jumpsuit, Isaiah carefully folded his civilian clothing before placing it inside the storage container. As he adjusted the sleeves of his uniform, he instinctively examined the hallway, the emergency exits, the security cameras, and the positions where correctional officers naturally stood during shift changes. Officer Grant quietly observed the habit without mentioning it. She assumed the newcomer simply paid close attention to details. Later that afternoon, Isaiah entered cell block C carrying his books beneath one arm. Conversations gradually slowed as experienced inmates watched the new arrival. Someone whispered that the quiet black inmate looked more like a teacher than a prisoner. Another laughed and called him professor. Isaiah simply acknowledged the greeting with a polite nod before continuing toward his assigned cell. His cellmate, Raymond Ellis, watched with curiosity as Isaiah carefully organized his books on the narrow metal shelf, made the bed with remarkable precision, and selected the lower bunk without hesitation. "You seem awfully organized for someone who just got here," Raymond remarked. Isaiah smiled calmly. "Order makes difficult places easier to understand." Raymond chuckled. "You are different from everyone else." Isaiah did not argue. During dinner that evening, he entered the cafeteria carrying his tray, quietly studied the layout of every table, noticed which groups occupied each section, observed which pathways remained clear, and chose a seat near an open aisle without attracting attention. He thanked the kitchen workers after receiving his meal, ate slowly, and left the cafeteria without speaking to anyone. Several inmates noticed that he never rushed, never reacted to insults drifting across the room, and never appeared intimidated. By the end of his first day inside Redstone State Prison, most inmates had already decided the quiet newcomer would become the easiest target in the housing unit, completely unaware that Isaiah Brooks had already memorized far more about the prison than anyone had realized. The second morning inside Redstone State Prison unfolded with the same rigid routine that governed every day behind its concrete walls. Steel doors slid open before sunrise, correctional officers completed the morning count, and inmates slowly filled the corridors as another predictable day began. Isaiah Brooks followed the routine with remarkable consistency. He folded his blanket with careful precision, arranged his books neatly beside his Bible, thanked Officer Melissa Grant as she completed the count, and quietly walked toward breakfast without attempting to join any conversation. Raymond Ellis watched him with growing curiosity. "You always seem to know exactly where you are going," Raymond remarked. Isaiah smiled faintly. "People make better decisions when they pay attention before they have to." Raymond laughed politely, believing the answer sounded more like advice than casual conversation. Throughout the morning, Isaiah spent much of his free time inside the prison library. While other inmates gathered around televisions or card tables, he sat beside a tall window reading a history book with complete concentration. Several inmates noticed that he occasionally paused, not because he was distracted, but because he quietly observed reflections in the window that revealed movement throughout the room behind him. Nothing about his behavior appeared dramatic, yet every action seemed deliberate. Later that afternoon, Isaiah walked through the main corridor toward the recreation yard. As he passed each intersection, he naturally glanced toward emergency exits, stairwells, security cameras, and officer stations before continuing without hesitation. "Officer." Grant happened to notice the pattern once again. "He studies this place every time he walks through it," she quietly told another officer. "Maybe he is just curious," her colleague replied. Grant slowly shook her head. "No, he notices details most people never even look at." Meanwhile, Derek Collins watched Isaiah from the upper walkway overlooking cell block C. The white prison bully had built his reputation by identifying weakness faster than anyone else inside Redstone. New arrivals usually displayed nervous habits, avoided eye contact, or desperately searched for protection. Isaiah displayed none of those behaviors. Instead, his calm confidence made Derek increasingly uncomfortable. One member of Derek's group leaned against the railing beside him and smirked. "The new guy is too quiet. We should remind him how things work around here." Derek nodded slowly without taking his eyes off Isaiah. "Tomorrow at lunch," he answered. "The cafeteria is where everyone learns their place." Word quietly spread through the housing unit before the evening meal even began. Several inmates whispered that Derek planned to make an example of the quiet newcomer. Raymond overheard the rumors and later approached Isaiah inside their cell. "You should probably avoid the cafeteria tomorrow," he warned. Isaiah calmly closed his notebook before answering. "Avoiding people rarely solves anything." Raymond frowned. "You really do not understand who Derek Collins is." Isaiah looked toward the barred window as warm evening light entered the cell. "I understand enough," he replied softly. "People who depend on fear usually expect everyone else to become afraid." Raymond wanted to continue the conversation, but Isaiah simply returned to reading as though nothing unusual awaited him. Outside the cell, whispers continued spreading throughout Redstone State Prison. By the time the lights dimmed that evening, nearly every inmate expected the next day's lunch to become another public display of humiliation, completely unaware that the quiet man they considered an easy target had already noticed far more about them than they had ever noticed about him. The following afternoon, the cafeteria inside Redstone State Prison filled more quickly than usual. Long before lunch officially began, inmates quietly gathered at their usual tables while whispered conversations traveled across the room. Almost everyone had heard the same rumor. Derek Collins intended to make an unforgettable example of the quiet newcomer. Even inmates who normally avoided trouble found seats with clear views of the center aisle. Officer Melissa Grant noticed the unusual atmosphere immediately. The room sounded loud enough to appear ordinary, yet an unmistakable tension lingered beneath every conversation. She exchanged a brief glance with another correctional officer before taking her position along the outer wall. Isaiah Brooks entered the cafeteria carrying his lunch tray with the same calm expression he had worn since arriving at Redstone. He thanked the kitchen worker who handed him his meal and slowly walked toward the open seating area. His pace never changed despite dozens of inmates quietly watching every step. As he approached an empty table near the center of the room, Derek Collins stepped directly into his path, with 4 members of his group standing just behind him. A confident smile spread across Derek's face, while several nearby inmates leaned forward in anticipation. "You did not take my advice yesterday," Derek said casually. Isaiah met his eyes without hostility. "You offered an opinion, not advice." Several inmates exchanged surprised glances. The answer contained neither fear nor disrespect. Derek chuckled before taking Isaiah's tray and placing it on another table several feet away. "Maybe you still have not figured out who decides where people eat." Isaiah calmly looked toward the tray before returning his attention to Derek. "A meal is easy to replace," he replied quietly. "Character is much harder." The unexpected response drew another wave of laughter from Derek's followers. One inmate deliberately bumped Isaiah's shoulder, while another blocked the opposite side. Within seconds, the circle around the newcomer became noticeably tighter. The surrounding crowd sensed that something dramatic was about to happen. Then, almost without warning, several inmates grabbed Isaiah and lifted him onto the wide cafeteria table in front of everyone. Plastic trays slid across the smooth surface as dozens of prisoners burst into laughter. Instead of reacting emotionally, Isaiah carefully placed both feet beneath him and rose into a steady standing position. He brushed a few crumbs from the front of his orange prison jumpsuit before slowly surveying the entire cafeteria. His eyes briefly moved across the correctional officers, the emergency exits, the serving line, and every face surrounding him. The movement appeared almost effortless, yet Officer Grant noticed that Isaiah had calmly assessed the entire room in only a few seconds. Derek folded his arms with obvious satisfaction. "Now everyone knows where you belong," he announced loudly. The laughter echoed once more, but it faded much faster than before. Isaiah looked directly at Derek with the same composed expression he had carried since entering the prison. Then, in a quiet voice that somehow reached every corner of the cafeteria, he said, "You still have one chance to walk away before you regret staying." The words contained no anger, no threat, and no panic. Their calm certainty unsettled the room far more than shouting ever could, leaving dozens of inmates suddenly wondering whether the quiet newcomer understood something that none of them had yet seen. The silence inside the cafeteria lasted only a few seconds, yet it felt much longer to everyone watching. Isaiah Brooks remained standing on the cafeteria table with steady posture and relaxed shoulders, making no attempt to challenge anyone. His calm expression confused the crowd more than any display of anger ever could. Derek Collins continued smiling, but the confidence behind that smile had begun to weaken. Something about the newcomer's composure refused to fit the situation unfolding before him. Most inmates placed in such a position reacted with fear, embarrassment, or desperation. Isaiah displayed none of those emotions. Instead, he slowly looked across the room as though confirming details only he considered important. Officer Melissa Grant noticed the same behavior from her position near the serving line. Isaiah briefly glanced toward the emergency exit, the hallway leading to the medical unit, the location of every correctional officer, and finally toward a maintenance door that remained closed beside the kitchen entrance. The movement lasted only a moment, yet it appeared unusually deliberate. Derek followed Isaiah's eyes before laughing loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Looking for someone to rescue you?" Several inmates laughed again, although their amusement sounded noticeably less certain than before. Isaiah quietly shook his head. "No," he answered. "I was making sure everyone still has a safe way out." The strange reply immediately drew puzzled expressions throughout the cafeteria. Raymond Ellis stared at Isaiah in disbelief. Officer Grant narrowed her eyes, sensing that the newcomer had recognized something she had not yet noticed. Even Derek hesitated for a brief second before dismissing the comment with another confident grin. "Nobody is going anywhere," he declared. Isaiah slowly stepped down from the cafeteria table without rushing. Instead of confronting Derek or attempting to push past the surrounding inmates, he carefully picked up a plastic cup that had fallen onto the floor, placed it neatly back on the nearest tray, and gently straightened one of the benches that had shifted during the commotion. His unexpected actions left several inmates exchanging confused glances. "Why are you cleaning up?" one of Derek's followers asked mockingly. Isaiah calmly replied, "People make poor decisions when they stop paying attention to small things." The answer sounded almost ordinary, yet Officer Grant suddenly looked toward the same maintenance door Isaiah had observed moments earlier. She noticed a faint blinking warning light beside the frame that should not have been illuminated during normal cafeteria operations. She immediately spoke into her radio and quietly requested maintenance staff to verify the signal. Within less than a minute, another officer hurried into the cafeteria and whispered several urgent words into her ear. Grant's expression changed instantly. She raised her voice so every inmate could hear. "Everyone move away from the kitchen. Entrance immediately and proceed toward the east exit in an orderly manner." The room froze. Confused inmates looked from the officers to Isaiah, suddenly remembering his calm warning only moments earlier. Derek turned toward the maintenance door as staff members quickly secured the area after discovering an unexpected equipment malfunction that required immediate evacuation of the cafeteria section. Without another word, Derek and his followers instinctively hurried toward the designated exit along with everyone else. As dozens of inmates moved quickly from the room under the direction of correctional officers, Raymond quietly looked back at Isaiah with astonishment. The quiet newcomer simply picked up his untouched lunch tray, waited patiently until everyone else had safely exited, and walked out last with the same composed expression that had puzzled the entire prison since the day he arrived. News of the cafeteria evacuation spread through Redstone State Prison before the evening count even began. Every housing unit carried a different version of the story, yet one detail remained exactly the same in every conversation. The quiet newcomer had calmly warned everyone before the correctional officers discovered the equipment malfunction. Some inmates insisted it had been luck. Others quietly believed Isaiah Brooks had noticed something no one else had seen. Derek Collins refused to admit that possibility aloud, but the unanswered questions continued following him throughout the afternoon. Inside cell block C, Raymond Ellis sat across from Isaiah while the two men organized their shelves before evening inspection. "You knew something was wrong before anyone else," Raymond finally said. Isaiah gently placed his history book onto the metal shelf before answering. "I noticed several details that did not belong together." Raymond looked confused. "What details?" Isaiah smiled politely. The warning light near the maintenance door was flashing, but the kitchen staff continued serving meals as though nothing had changed. One employee also glanced toward that door several times within a minute. When small details stop matching, it is usually wise to pay attention. Raymond slowly shook his head. "Most people never would have noticed any of that," Isaiah calmly replied. "Most people are watching other people instead of watching their surroundings." The conversation quietly ended there. Later that evening, Officer Melissa Grant requested permission to review Isaiah's transfer paperwork again. She had spent years working inside correctional facilities and had rarely encountered someone with such remarkable observational discipline. The official records described Isaiah as cooperative, respectful, and highly educated, but one additional document immediately captured her attention. Before his incarceration, Isaiah had served for many years as a professional emergency preparedness consultant who trained schools, hospitals, businesses, and public institutions to recognize warning signs, improve evacuation procedures, and remain calm during unexpected crises. The file contained multiple letters praising his ability to identify hazards long before they became emergencies. Grant quietly leaned back in her chair, suddenly understanding why the newcomer had calmly surveyed exits, cameras, officer positions, and maintenance equipment since arriving at Redstone. The following morning, Derek watched Isaiah from across the recreation yard. For the first time since becoming the unofficial leader of the housing unit, he found himself uncertain about someone standing only a few yards away. Isaiah quietly sat beneath the shade of a concrete overhang reading another history book while several inmates passed without disturbing him. Derek noticed something else had changed overnight. The same inmates who had laughed during the cafeteria incident now greeted Isaiah with respectful nods before continuing on their way. Nobody treated him like a celebrity, yet nobody dismissed him as an easy target anymore. Raymond eventually sat beside Isaiah and asked the question everyone inside Redstone seemed to be wondering. If you knew there might be danger, why did you warn Derek too? Isaiah closed his book and looked across the recreation yard before answering in the same calm voice that never seemed to change. Because wisdom has no value if it only protects the people we already like. Raymond quietly lowered his eyes, realizing that the lesson carried far more weight than anything that had happened inside the cafeteria the previous afternoon. By the end of the week, Redstone State Prison no longer viewed Isaiah Brooks as simply the quiet newcomer who had arrived carrying a cardboard property box and a few hardcover books. The cafeteria incident had changed far more than a single afternoon. It had changed the way people observed him. Every morning, inmates noticed that Isaiah followed the exact same routine without exception. He folded his blanket with careful precision, thanked every correctional officer who treated him professionally, returned library books on time, and quietly spent hours reading while others searched for distractions. Nothing about his behavior suggested someone interested in proving himself. Ironically, that quiet consistency attracted more respect than loud confidence ever could. Derek Collins noticed the change as clearly as everyone else. During recreation, several inmates who once competed for Derek's approval now stopped to greet Isaiah before continuing across the yard. None of them crowded around him. None of them asked for favors. They simply acknowledged him with genuine respect. Derek watched the scene from across the basketball court with growing frustration, not because Isaiah had challenged his authority, but because he had earned admiration without trying. One afternoon, Derek finally approached Isaiah near the prison library. There was no audience waiting for entertainment, no circle of inmates expecting another confrontation. Only a few correctional officers walked quietly through the corridor while several inmates organized returned books inside the library. Derek stopped several feet away. "You could have embarrassed me after the evacuation," he admitted. "Everyone would have believed whatever you said." Isaiah closed the history book resting in his hands before looking at him. That would not have helped anyone. Derek studied the quiet inmate for several moments. Most people would have taken advantage of that moment. Isaiah smiled gently. Most people spend too much time trying to win arguments instead of improving tomorrow. The answer lingered between them long after the conversation ended. Later that evening, Officer Melissa Grant met Isaiah while completing routine paperwork outside the library. "I read part of your professional background," she said honestly. "Now I understand why you noticed the warning signs." Isaiah nodded politely. Experience teaches people to recognize patterns. Grant hesitated before asking another question. "Why never mention what you used to do?" Isaiah looked through the tall security window toward the fading sunset beyond the prison walls. "Because every person here deserves the chance to know who I am today instead of judging who I used to be." Grant quietly smiled, realizing that the answer explained the man far better than any official record ever could. Across the housing unit, conversations gradually shifted away from rumors about the cafeteria. Instead, Inmates began discussing the lessons Isaiah shared without realizing he was teaching them. Raymond Ellis later summarized the change perfectly while speaking with another prisoner. "He never tells people they are wrong," Raymond said. "He simply lives in a way that makes everyone think differently." As evening count echoed through Redstone State Prison once again, Isaiah returned another finished history book to the library cart and calmly walked back toward his cell. Behind him, Derek remained standing in thoughtful silence, slowly recognizing that genuine influence does not come from making people afraid. It comes from becoming the kind of person others naturally choose to respect, even when no one asks them to do so. Several days after the cafeteria evacuation, life inside Redstone State Prison appeared ordinary again. Yet almost everyone understood that something had permanently changed. The conversations had become quieter whenever Isaiah Brooks entered a room. The jokes had disappeared. Even inmates who had never spoken to him before now offered respectful nods as they passed through the corridors. Isaiah accepted every greeting with the same calm smile before continuing toward the library, never acting as though he had earned special treatment. One afternoon, Officer Melissa Grant assigned several inmates to help organize old maintenance records stored beside the library. Isaiah volunteered without hesitation. While carefully arranging dusty boxes onto metal shelves, he noticed a faded emergency evacuation map hanging slightly crooked on the wall. He quietly straightened the frame before continuing his work. Grant watched the small gesture with curiosity. "You always notice things everyone else ignores," she remarked. Isaiah smiled politely. Small details often protect people long before large problems appear. A nearby inmate overheard the conversation and asked, "Is that really how you used to make a living?" Isaiah paused for only a moment before answering honestly. "For many years I helped schools, hospitals, businesses, and public buildings prepare for emergencies. My job was never to predict disasters. My job was to help people recognize warning signs before fear replaced clear thinking." The simple explanation spread through the library more quickly than Isaiah expected. Within an hour, inmates throughout cell block C were quietly discussing the newcomer's former profession. Suddenly, everything about his behavior made sense. His constant awareness of exits, his habit of observing surroundings, his calm voice during stressful moments, and even his unusual patience all reflected years of professional discipline rather than mysterious luck. That evening, Derek Collins approached Officer Melissa Grant while she completed routine paperwork outside the housing unit. "Is the story true?" he asked. Grant looked up briefly. His records confirm he spent years training organizations to prepare for emergencies and protect people through planning instead of panic. Derek remained silent for several seconds before nodding slowly. "Then he was trying to protect everyone in the cafeteria, including me." Grant simply replied, "That is exactly what happened." Later that night, Raymond Ellis sat beside Isaiah inside their shared cell. "You could have told everyone who you were from the beginning," he said. Isaiah gently closed another finished history book before answering. "People usually remember what you do for them much longer than what you say about yourself." Raymond smiled thoughtfully. "Maybe that is why everyone respects you now." Isaiah quietly looked through the narrow window toward the fading evening light beyond the prison walls. Respect that comes from honesty lasts longer than respect that comes from fear. As the lights dimmed across Redstone State Prison, Derek stood alone on the upper walkway overlooking the housing unit. He watched Isaiah calmly return his books to the shelf before preparing for evening count with the same quiet discipline he demonstrated every single day. For the first time in many years, Derek realized that the strongest person inside the prison had never raised his voice, demanded attention, or tried to prove anything. That realization lingered in his mind long after the corridors became silent, quietly reshaping the way he viewed leadership, strength, and the true meaning of earning another person's respect. Several weeks later, Redstone State Prison looked exactly the same from the outside, yet the people living behind its walls understood that something meaningful had changed. Steel gates still opened before sunrise. Correctional officers still completed the morning count with quiet professionalism. The cafeteria remained crowded at lunchtime, and the recreation yard continued filling every afternoon. The routines never changed, but the attitudes of many inmates had transformed in ways no official report could measure. Isaiah Brooks continued living with the same steady discipline that had defined him from the moment he arrived. Every morning, he carefully folded his blanket, organized his books beside his Bible, thanked correctional officers who treated everyone fairly, and walked through the prison without expecting recognition. He never reminded anyone about the cafeteria evacuation, never mentioned his years of professional experience, and never spoke as though he deserved greater respect than anyone else. To Isaiah, character was something demonstrated every day rather than announced once. Derek Collins also changed in ways that surprised many inmates. His reputation no longer depended on humiliating newcomers or controlling every conversation inside the cafeteria. Instead, he quietly discouraged pointless intimidation whenever he saw it beginning. One afternoon, a newly transferred inmate entered the dining hall carrying a lunch tray, while several prisoners prepared to repeat the same kind of public embarrassment Isaiah had experienced. Derek calmly stepped between them before anyone acted. "Let him eat," he said simply. "You do not know his story." The room became silent for only a moment before everyone returned to lunch without another word. Raymond Ellis witnessed the exchange from across the cafeteria and smiled quietly to himself. Later that evening, he found Isaiah returning another history book to the prison library. "You changed this place," Raymond said honestly. Isaiah gently shook his head. "People change themselves when they decide to see things differently." Raymond looked around the peaceful library before asking one final question. "Do you ever regret staying so quiet about everything you accomplished before coming here?" Isaiah paused beside the bookshelf before answering. "If people respect me because of my past, they only admire old memories. If they respect me because of how I treat others today, then the respect has real value." Raymond slowly nodded, understanding that the answer reflected the same quiet wisdom Isaiah had demonstrated from the beginning. As the evening sun cast warm light through the high-security windows, Officer Melissa Grant completed one final walk through the housing unit before the night shift arrived. She noticed Isaiah reading peacefully inside his cell, Derek speaking respectfully with another inmate nearby, and an atmosphere far calmer than the one that existed only weeks earlier. She quietly realized that the greatest influence inside Redstone had never come from the loudest voice or the strongest reputation. It had come from one patient man who chose observation instead of panic, humility instead of pride, and compassion instead of revenge. Long after the details of the cafeteria incident faded into memory, the lesson remained. People may judge appearance in a single moment, but true character is revealed through countless quiet choices that continue long after everyone else stops watching.